Hi, welcome to Jot Notes, a podcast where we dive into the world of authors and books. My name is Jenna Green, a YA fantasy author, and with me is Miranda O, a contemporary chick lit author. And she has the privilege and honor of introducing our guest for today. Hi, Miranda.
Hello, hello. I am thrilled to introduce our guest today. And the reason I'm thrilled is, well, I'm thrilled for multiple reasons, but Robert J Sawyer has been a author that has always stood dear to my heart since I got into the writing world. So I am super, super excited to have you on our show today. Now, Robert is a Canadian science fiction author with more than 20 titles in print. He has won the Nebula and Hugo Award and has given the Order of Canada, which is the highest honor given by the government of Canada. That is pretty spectacular. And his 24th novel is called The Oppenheimer Alternative. So welcome. We're thrilled and excited and overjoyed to have you with us today.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Jenna. I'm thrilled to be here myself. Thank you.
So I want to start where it began. Do you remember when and where your love of writing and science fiction began?
Yes, and it actually began just before, moments before, I read my first science fiction novel. My brother Peter had bought a novel, acquired it at a used bookstore or something, called Trouble on Titan by a man named Alan E. Nurse. It's pronounced nurse, but spelled Nourse. And ironically, he was a medical doctor, so he was Dr. Nurse. But the book was a YA science fiction novel set on Titan, one of Saturn's moons. But it started before the book, you got into it, there was an essay by Nurse or an introduction called I've Never Been There. And he talks in that, it's only a couple of pages, about the joy of being a science fiction writer, how much fun it was to make up plausible, reasonable extrapolation, but to use his imagination to figure out what the future might be like. And I thought, well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And then I read his book and loved the book as well. I still remember it absolutely vividly, Trouble on Titan by Alan E. Nurse. But it was because he said, unlike the usual journey, which is you sort of discover reading, and then it sort of dawns on you that somebody must write these books. And then eventually you piece it together. Maybe I could write a book too. It's not like that, wasn't like that at all for me. It was before I'd even read a science fiction book. Somebody said, come on over. And water's fine. Dive in. This is going to be a lot of fun to work in this field. And so I think I was 12 years old, but that was it. I was hooked.
Obviously, I'm not a science fiction author, but the fantasy genre, they're similar in that world building,
Yes.
Inventing and things. And I remember when I took a children's lit class, university, that's when I was exposed to the essays of Tolkien. Right before that, I only knew about his fiction writing, but some of his essays on world building, I found quite fascinating and a good basis for that idea of staying true to your world. Like you can invent pretty much whatever you want, at least in fantasy. And then as long as you stick to it and you believe it, if you believe it, the audience will believe it.
Well, that's right. Consistency absolutely matters. We happen to be doing this podcast live on Facebook right now. It's being recorded, but it's being done on a Thursday night. And when this is over, I'm going to go and watch the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery. Well, they've had a universe that they've been building since 1966 when Star Trek debuted. So
Right.
56 years this year of Star Trek history under the belt. And what makes people stay in that universe is that it's a consistency, a breadth, a depth of world building, of creating a history that's true to its own rules. And when Star Trek fails, and it does from time to time, sometimes whole series have really not caught on, like Star Trek Enterprise from 20 years ago, in large measure because it contradicted what we had come to know and understand to be the Star Trek A, core values, and B, history that had been put together.
I never thought about it that way, and excuse me, And it is so true with fantasy and science fiction. I don't write in those genres, but they do fascinate me because there's a whole other component to building your story versus just write out your characters and the story that way. The whole world is a story in itself. Now,
the world is a character in a lot of ways.
The world is a character.
Sure.
That's right. That's right.
For sure.
There's a reason the movie that's in theaters right now and based on the most famous or the best-selling science fiction novel of all time is called Dune and not Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib is the name of the main character, Paul Atreides, another name he goes by. It's called Dune. The world is the main character in that book. The world Arrakis, also known as the planet Dune. Also known as the planet Canopus 3 for real SF fans, but yes.
So when you are creating these worlds, does it involve a lot of research, kind of comparing to what other science fiction worlds have been built? Like, what does a research for a new world look like for you?
Well, most of my stuff is set in the near future or the present day on Earth. I have done the building of alien societies and alien worlds, but you don't do it by researching what other science fiction writers have done. You do it by researching the science. I dig deeply into astronomy, geology, ecology. In fact, I mentioned Dune a moment ago. Dune is dedicated by Frank Herbert, the author who wrote the novel Dune. It's dedicated to the dry land ecologists who make deserts bloom. It's dedicated to the scientists who had studied what we could do with desolate desert land. And that's what his whole first novel, and then the 7 that he wrote, and the quite a few others that his son, along with Kevin Anderson, have written, the 3 versions of the movie, they all come back to him knowing ecology and studying that field. So yeah, we science fiction writers, we take our research from real science.
And that's where you should take it after I said it. And then you said what you said. It makes way more sense.
I don't mean to interrupt, Miranda. I'm sorry. And it's the same as with a mystery writer. A mystery writer doesn't go and say, I wonder how Agatha Christie, would have done this. They go and say, how would a modern CSI, crime scene investigator, how would a forensicist do this? How would the district attorney, or here in Canada, the Crown attorney, how would they approach making sure they had an airtight case in something like this? And so you're a historical writer, reads history, and Tolkien, right? Tolkien, who was a great scholar, knew about the Middle Ages, knew about history, and had deeply researched the study of mythology. Hadn't just read myths, but had read about the study of myths, the science of mythology, or the discipline of mythology.
I used to say that I didn't do research. I was like, I fantasy, I make everything up. I used to say I did reverse research. When I wrote my sequel, I'd have to go back and remember what I'd made up. But I don't say that anymore because I realized that a lot of my ideas come from things I've read. I might not have been like setting down to like go and research, but and a lot of anthropology. Like if you're inventing cultures, they might be, like fantastical beasts and stuff, but they have a culture. Yep. And even when you're describing their homes and what they eat, there's a lot of that study of culture in it that a naive former Jenna used to say research, but it is. I just, but everyone has their own take to research, right? Some might sit down for 5 years.
Right.
Oh, indeed. For those who are watching on video over my shoulder, and I can never do it right mirrored, but there's a book somewhere over here. There it is. The Oppenheimer Alternative, my latest novel. I spent 2 years doing full-time research for that novel. And it was largely historical research because it's about J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, the birth of the atomic age, an alternate history novel about them. But to write alternate history, to write counterfactual history, or history that at least fills in the blanks of things that we don't actually know about that period, you have to know that period. And I had to dive in and read the biographies of all the main characters, Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, and in some cases, the autobiographies for those who had written them. Oppenheimer never wrote one, but many of the characters did. The history of the period, the physics of nuclear weapons, the politics that came out of the nuclear age. Absolutely, just immerse yourself in it as a writer, and you don't know what you're looking for necessarily. A bad writer writes a log and says, okay, I put 5 X's in a row in my manuscript to remind me when I come back and do revisions, I have to look up what year the Battle of Hastings was. A good writer starts out by not knowing what they're looking for, but following their nose where the research leads them with a writer's keen sense of what would be interesting to dramatize. You're looking for historical or scientific or even philosophical or psychological facts that you can say, yeah, I can see a story coming out of that. I can see a character getting their teeth into that. That's what research is all about.
Man, I was going to ask you some tips on how to research, and I feel like you just gave us a whole bunch of tips. But obviously there is a massive part of creating science fiction stories and worlds that heavily relies on research. So what are some things that you've learned over the years to help make the research process effective and efficient?
Sure.
2 years is a long time to dedicate a full time.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is to be fully willing to embrace your ignorance and say you don't know anything. I did a novel some years ago called Frame Shift, which was about genetics. And at the time, I knew what a little bit I remembered from high school biology, but that was it. And so I got myself a book called The Cartoon Guide to Genetics and started with that. And there's the cartoon guide to almost any topic you want to look for. There's the very short introduction series from Oxford University Press, which is designed for beginners in any field to get your feet wet. Start with a beginning thing. Wikipedia is not a good place to start, often because their articles can be very, very technical. And you go, I don't understand, this word, that word, whatever. Start with an absolute beginner's book. Even sometimes a YA, not a YA novel, but a book aimed at a young middle grade audience. A perfectly good place to start.
Yep.
And then a harder book, and then a more difficult book. And by the time I was finished, researching the Oppenheimer Alternative, I was reading peer-reviewed scientific journal technical papers about the Manhattan Project, but I understood every word because I'd worked my way up to them. So just be willing to embrace the fact that you don't know anything, but that your readers are going to expect by the time you write the book that you know everything, and you should.
Yeah.
But then
true.
You got to prune. You can't put everything that you've learned in the book. I wish I knew. Oh, I do know. Wilma Meyer, I think, was who came up with this, who was the ran the writer's workshop on CompuServe, a service from the very early days of the public internet. She ran the writer's workshop, and she would call sections where writers have put everything they've learned into their book. This would be the I have suffered for my art, and now you, the reader, are going to suffer too part of the book, right?
The info dump.
1,000 things, and you cherry pick the ones that are most heartbreaking, colorful, interesting, and exciting out of the vast array of things that you know about a topic.
Whenever I think about research, I know I probably couldn't write anything historical because I'd be that person going, look what I know, I suffered. But it always brings me back to the Iliad and reading that. And you read it and you get to that chapter, the catalog of the ships, and it's like 49 pages long of just going, this person, son of this person, had this ship. Yes. And then they just keep going. And you're like, okay, I get it's a classic. I get, there's history and mythology, but as a reader, you just want to bang your head against the wall.
Right. It's like
that part.
The begats in the Bible. And I'll tell you, come back to Dune as an example of world building here, because Frank Herbert's Dune, the most successful in terms of sales, the biggest selling science fiction novel in history, was rejected by every science fiction publisher. The book finally came out in 1965, and the publisher was a company called Chilton. Now, do either of you know Chilton?
Well, I know
Chilton
Gilmore
is a
Girls.
huge publisher in one area, automotive repair manuals.
Oh my
They
God.
published Dune. That was their first foray into fiction. And they made one change that made it from a novel that everybody rejected to becoming this breakout book that now we have our third film version of. There was a Sci-Fi Channel one, and people are scratching their head of what the second one was. That was the second one.
I want to know what the change
And
is.
what they did was there's this gigantic thing at the beginning called Terminology of the Imperium, which is a glossary of all these made up terms, and it runs for dozens of pages. And the editor at Chilton said, I'm going to make one change. This goes from the front of the book
To the back.
to the back of the book. And we start diving into the story. And if people get lost by the terminology, let them flip to the back and, oh yeah, remind themselves that a Bene Gesserit is a sorcerer woman, blah, blah, blah. Don't make them digest all that up front. Have it where they can look it up if they need to or if they've forgotten. And that made all the difference. So yeah, Homer, we remember him very fondly, but that's not a part of the Iliad that we remember with great delight.
Well, and it shows how the entertainment and literature changes over time, right? I mean,
Yep.
prologues used to be a huge thing, and now, my editors say like, no, it's like a paragraph or nothing, unless it's really readed. I've published 6 novels. I've been allowed one once,
Yeah.
right? Whereas, I remember the books I read growing up, and they all had prologues some that were great and some that you kind of muddled through.
Let's just find chapter 1.
Well, exactly. I mean, the very simple thing is you got to start it somewhere where it's interesting.
Yeah.
If a prologue is just an info dump, just a whole bunch of history to set the stage, then it means you haven't really done your job. Your job is, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or historical fiction, anything other than straightforward mimetic fiction that's imitative of the present day of real life, you have to skillfully weave all that stuff into the narrative instead of dumping it and saying, here's the history lesson, or here's the science lesson, or whatever. You weave it in so elegantly. That's the job. And it's a very tough job to do. A prologue, the reason they're frowned on is that so many writers do them as the easy way of giving the background information instead of doing the really hard work of elegantly peppering it as a seasoning that spices up the narrative as you go along, anticipating what the reader has to know in advance of them knowing it, but giving it to them in a way that is so effortless, they haven't even been aware that they've learned it until they go, oh my God, of course he can't go left, because everybody knows that the orcs always attack from that side. Naturally, he chose to go to the right, even though there's a cliff face there. Duh. But you didn't know that you needed to know that until that moment, and you weren't even aware that you'd picked it up until that moment. And then you have a literal cliffhanger. Your character is turned to the cliff because things that the reader knows to be true without having been lectured about have motivated that only possible choice for your character.
As a teacher, I will verify nobody wants to be lectured to.
That's right. Nobody does. And I just lectured here. So
Well,
one of my favorite Far Side cartoons is
but we're absorbing it. It's an exciting lecture. There are exciting lectures.
I'm fascinated.
The thing Billy feared most of all was his father's lectures. And there's his dad with the blackboard. And
I just want to know how you took. So you have all this information. You're aware you have to sprinkle it in, but you're also basing it off real events and but you're twisting it. Like, how did you pull that off? Like, what is the premises of the Oppenheimer Alternative? Because
yeah, sure. So
what is your take on it?
Oppenheimer.
That was a very elegantly framed question, I got to say.
Oppenheimer was a national hero. He was the scientific director of the effort that created an atomic bomb, that was used to end the war in the Pacific of World War II. And he later lost his security clearance, which is amazing, right? This is the guy who basically let the Allies win the Second World War. And then a few years later, he is put on a McCarthy-esque trial for being a communist sympathizer. And they decide, yeah, you are, and you're not safe to be in charge of the nuclear or have access to the nuclear secrets of the country. When that happened in real life, Oppenheimer said, if a journalist were to dig deeply enough, he presumed a he at that time for a journalist, would discover that this is a much bigger story than just my security suspension. Also, at the same time, Oppenheimer's second in command, a man named Deke Parsons, said, oh my God, I've got to talk to Ike, Ike being President Eisenhower. This, the security hearing, is the worst mistake the United States could make. Unfortunately, Deke Parsons had a heart attack the next day and died before he talked to Eisenhower. But these are incredibly provocative statements that are a real part of the historical record. And nobody has ever written the story of what the heck it was that both Oppenheimer and his second in command were alluding to. What was this bigger story? So I wanted to find out what it was, and nobody knows, so I got to make it up. But it had to be consistent with everything we do know about Oppenheimer, about his personal history, about the security concerns surrounding him. And then because I'm a science fiction writer, it also had to be a science fictional kind of thing. So it's a science fiction alternate history that doesn't contradict what we know about Oppenheimer, but does fill in the blank spots that really are there and are very provocatively teased by Oppenheimer before he died in real life about what might have really happened. That's the Oppenheimer Alternative.
Yeah.
I could just see you researching and all these ideas just percolating in your head, going like, oh, here's a tidbit of information. I could take it this way. Oh, here's a different tidbit of information. I could take it this way. And then you just, once you're, let's call it done, that phase of your research, you now have all these opportunities to explore and make up. It would, I could just see all the light bulbs. It'd be like fireworks going off in my brain.
It is, and again, ignorance. I knew everybody knows a little bit about Oppenheimer. I mean, he's obviously an important historical figure, but I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just followed my nose. And when I came to those quotes I gave you, or another one of his, when he was asked fairly late in his life, by a university student who was didn't really too young to remember World War II. So your atomic bomb was the first one ever exploded? And he goes, yes. Well, in historical times. What is he referring to? Right? I mean, oh my God, that's a tidbit that's a dot that you can draw the connecting lines between and come up with a story to tell about.
It's like a tweak in that, fantasy and sci-fi, we often write about what if there were dragons, what if we lived on Mars. This is more like a what could
yeah, absolutely, what might have been or what could have. It had to be plausible. And I guess the point I want to make, to bring it all back to the writerly discussion of research, is you're a detective when you're doing research. You don't know, all you know is that a crime is going to be committed. That crime is going to be your novel. And what you want is, you're doing research looking for things that, well, that's weird. That's strange. That's a little bit out of place. I can't make sense of that. Why did that person act that way? You're doing exactly what a detective is doing, looking for the things that, hey, wait a minute. Oh, what? That's interesting. Huh? How come? And those are the things that you're gathering, making notes about. Many writers have many different note-taking methods. I have a little digital recorder with me where I'll say, make a little note. And I actually just feed this into voice transcription software, so my notes are actually typed up for me. I'm too lazy to type them up myself at the end of the day. But, these are fleeting little details. And anybody who reads mystery fiction knows that the detective who ultimately solves the crime hasn't picked up on the big, bloody, red stained hands of the murderer who is still holding the knife. He's picking up on, why did the murderer go to lunch wearing one set of clothes, come back having changed his shirt? Oh, he said he worked out at the gym. But, the gyms are closed. It's COVID-19, right? It's a piecing together and following a trail. And that's what you do as a researcher, looking for, they're not clues, but they're tidbits that are going to make an enticing tale that ultimately, as you said, Jenna, holds together. It has to be internally consistent at the end, no matter what genre you're writing in.
Yeah.
I got to get a voice recorder because I got 10,000 Post-its, and my husband's always like, can I throw this out? It just says red. I'm like, no, that's important. They say that word, or like a word they say, and I'm like, that's very relevant. He doesn't.
That's right. Yeah. There are all kinds of technological ways you can do it. Some writers will use the service Evernote, which will let you take pictures of your Post-its and does OCR on your handwriting so that you can search for them. And, all the Post-its that mention bloody knife, and you might have 25 of them, and they all come up to and show you, find them for you. But yeah, an organized system. The one system that isn't organized and doesn't have really fast retrieval is your noggin. So you have to have some external way of keeping track of your research data.
I've gotten better at it as I go along.
For sure. We all do.
Practice makes perfect. Practice. Total practice.
I remember starting off with the hand-drawn maps, except I can't draw, so I wrote the word tree 5 times.
Right. But yeah, absolutely. And whether you're making up a fantasy land or plotting out a murder mystery, right? The readers will remember that you said that the dining room was on the left in chapter 1. You better remember that it was on the left too in chapter 18, or they'll be, wait a minute, they're making a mental map. You've got to have a map that you refer to and make sure that you haven't screwed up. I
love that this applies to all writers.
Sure.
All readers in that consistency. And that's why sometimes beta readers are so important. I mean, some of us get to write full time, and a lot of us don't. And so, you're working on projects and you have to take a break. And, I've had beta readers point out like, that character died 2 chapters ago.
Yes.
Right. But this is some good advice for any writers that are listening, whether they want to write sci-fi or whether they want to write historical. And then a little insight from the reader's perspective of what goes on in the background of writing. I mean, some people do know, but a lot of people, they don't always know what's going on behind the scenes in writing.
And there's a lot that goes behind the scenes in order to get a book out in order that you're reading, like the amount of time and hours and heartbreak and blood, sweat, and tears that goes into an actual book that you can pick up. I think unless you've experienced it, you've written one yourself, or somebody who's written one, we just assume, hey, somebody's going heavy at the keyboard for 20, 30, 40 hours, and then bam, you got a book. And that's just not the case.
Most of my writing is me staring off into space. And my husband's like, what are you doing? I'm like,
exactly. And the most important thing, you mentioned your husband, Jenna, the most important thing is whoever you live with, to train them to recognize that when you're just staring off into space, you're working. Don't interrupt. There's a whole bunch going on in here. You're trying to connect the dots mentally or recall something or think of an ideal phrase. And when somebody says, oh, it's a nice day, isn't it? Boom. All of that house of cards that you're building in your head comes tumbling down. So yeah, it really is the part of it that's typing on the keyboard. A good typist, and I'm not, but a good professional typist can type a manuscript page a minute. And book is 400 manuscript pages. So in less than 6 hours, a good typist can type a book's length worth of words. But you can't think of a page. If you do it a good page, for many writers, a good single page is a good day's work.
Yep.
I'm going to add a little tidbit before we sum up, because I need to express my inner nerd. But I do have a signal from my husband. from when we first started dating and living with each other, because he didn't know if I was doing schoolwork, if I'm playing
Right.
solitaire. So I have a tiara. That's the signal. If the tiara's on, that means that she's staring into space for a reason.
Very good. Very good.
Or if
My
I just
signal is that if I've started drooling, I've fallen asleep.
Nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise,
When
don't disturb me.
breathing gets heavy, I am
That's right.
unconscious.
Oh, this has been thrilling. I felt like the literary vibes in the Battle of Hastings was in 1066. I don't know why I know that, but I know that.
Yes, that's right.
But so the half hour just flew by on us, and that's fortunate but unfortunate because we have to say goodbye. But just before we go, can you tell us where our viewers and listeners can find your latest book, all your books, but your latest books, and where they can find more information on all your writing?
Sure. The Oppenheimer Alternative is traditionally published, so it should be in better bookstores and Amazon and so forth, but it's also available in ebook format and audiobook format. My website, I am a science fiction writer. My website is sfwriter.com. S is in science, F is in fiction, writer.com. And I'm on various social media as my full name, Robert J Sawyer, with no punctuation. So at Robert J Sawyer on Twitter, Robert J Sawyer on Patreon, Robert J Sawyer on Facebook.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being on our show. It was a privilege and an honor. Just before we go, I'd love to say a thank you to our show sponsors, Creative Edge Publicity and the Writers Corner Network, and above all else, all our viewers and all our listeners. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.